Welcome back, Night Owls, to another journey into the unknown. Tonight, we're diving deep into the shadows with 3 stories that will have you questioning every bump in the night. If you think you've heard it all, think again. These tales explore eerie encounters in isolated places where mystery reigns, and secrets are kept well hidden until now. So grab a light, hold on tight, and don't forget, what we're about to uncover might just keep you awake tonight. Ready to enter the darkness? Let's begin. The Outpost. In the summer of 2017, I landed an internship that seemed too good to pass up. 2 months working with a small wildlife research team in the remote mountains of northern Alaska. We were studying how climate change was affecting endangered species in the area. The isolation didn't bother me. In fact, it sounded like the adventure of a lifetime. No cell service, no internet, just us, the wilderness, and the work. There were 5 of us at the outpost: Dr. Langley, the lead researcher; Ben, a seasoned field biologist; Liz, a technician; Marcus, another intern like me; and me. The outpost itself was a small, rough cabin with a few rooms for sleeping, a common area, and a small radio station we used for communication when necessary. We were hours from the nearest town, completely cut off from civilization. The nearest ranger station was about 20 miles east, but we only had a satellite phone for true emergencies. The first few weeks went by smoothly enough. We hiked to different monitoring sites, observed wildlife and logged data, and at night, we'd gather in the common room, heating our food over a small propane stove. The isolation was peaceful, but as the days passed, a strange tension began to creep in, and the sense of calm shifted into something darker. It started with a discovery. Marcus and I were out one afternoon hiking back from a monitoring station when we came across something strange. A massive hole, maybe 10 feet wide, torn into the earth. The edges were raw, as if something had recently clawed its way out. There were no tracks, no debris, just the gaping hole in the ground. "You think it's a sinkhole?" Marcus asked, staring down into the dark pit. I shook my head, feeling a chill run down my spine. "I don't know, but we should tell Dr. Langley." We radioed back to the outpost, and Dr. Langley told us to return immediately. By the time we got back, she was waiting for us at the door, her face pale and tight with concern. "I don't want anyone going near that thing again," she said, her voice sharp. "It's not natural." There was something in the way she said it, like she knew more than she was letting on. Her words hung heavy in the air, and none of us laughed or brushed it off the way we normally would. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the hole. What had caused it? What was inside it? Around midnight I heard something. Scratching sounds, faint but unmistakable. They seemed to come from within the walls, like something small was crawling behind them. I sat up, straining to listen, but the noise stopped just as suddenly as it had begun. The next morning, Marcus was gone. At first, we thought maybe he'd gone out early to check the equipment. It wasn't unusual for him to head out before the rest of us. But when noon came and went without a word from him, Dr. Langley called a meeting. "I think something's happened to Marcus," she said, her voice unusually calm. "I want everyone to stay inside until we figure out what's going on." Ben, the biologist, wasn't having it. "Stay inside," he repeated, his eyes wide. "He could be hurt out there, or worse. We need to look for him." Dr. Langley's response was icy. "I said we stay inside. We don't know what's out there." The look in her eyes made my stomach twist. It wasn't just concern for Marcus. She was scared of something she wasn't telling us. Later that night, the scratching noises returned. This time, they were louder, more insistent. The sounds moved through the walls, almost like they were following something, or someone. The next morning, Ben had had enough. He grabbed his gear, determined to go out and find Marcus despite Dr. Langley's warnings. "If you won't do anything, I will," he said angrily, storming out of the cabin. Liz and I stood frozen as he disappeared into the trees, his figure quickly swallowed by the thick forest. Dr. Langley didn't move. She just stood there, her face pale. "He's not coming back," she said softly, almost to herself. The hours passed in tense silence. By nightfall, Ben still hadn't returned, and the outpost was filled with an unbearable sense of dread. None of us spoke about it, but we all felt it. Something was wrong. The peaceful isolation of the wilderness had turned into something sinister, and whatever was happening had started the moment we found that hole. That night I heard it again, the scratching, but this time it wasn't just in the walls. It was in the ceiling, moving slowly from one end of the cabin to the other. Something, or someone, was inside the building. I jumped out of bed, grabbing my flashlight, and hurried to the common area. Liz was already there, her flashlight trembling in her hand. "You heard it too, didn't you?" she whispered, her eyes wide with fear. Before I could answer, the power went out. The heater died, leaving us in freezing darkness. And in that silence, we heard them. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, coming down the hall. Dr. Langley appeared from the shadows, her face lit by the weak beam of her flashlight. "We need to leave. Now." We followed her outside, not even bothering to gather our things. As soon as we stepped into the cold night air, I realized how deep into the wilderness we really were. No roads, no lights, nothing but endless forest and mountains. But we didn't have a choice. Whatever was inside the outpost wasn't Marcus or Ben. We ran. I don't know how long we ran. Hours, maybe. The cold bit into my skin, and the uneven terrain made it hard to keep moving. But we couldn't stop. The thing, whatever it was behind us, moving through the trees. Its footsteps echoed in the frozen air, getting closer with every second. At some point, we found an old abandoned eco ranger station, barely visible through the trees. We stumbled toward it, desperate for shelter. The door was unlocked, and we bolted inside, collapsing against the walls in exhaustion. I don't remember much after that. The next thing I knew, I was being pulled into a heated room, a man's voice calling my name. Liz and I had been found by a ranger patrol, half frozen and delirious, wandering near the station. They never found Marcus or Ben. Dr. Langley was never seen again. And as for the hole, when they went back to the outpost, it was gone. No sign it had ever existed. The last message. I had never believed in ghosts, but working as a 911 dispatcher, I'd heard all sorts of stories from people in desperate situations. My job was to help, to reassure them that someone was on the way. But one night, I took a call that I'll never forget. It was late, a little past 2 a.m., and the dispatch center was quiet except for the hum of computers and the occasional rustle of papers. I was about to take a quick break when a call came through, and I answered automatically, not thinking anything of it. 911, what's your emergency? I asked, my voice calm and professional. There was silence on the other end, a faint crackling that I almost mistook for static. Then, a voice, a man's voice, low and trembling, came through. Please, help me. The desperation in his tone sent chills down my spine. Sir, can you tell me where you are? There was a pause, and then he whispered, I'm at 432 Vieux Carré. I don't have much time. I scribbled down the address, feeling a sense of urgency I couldn't explain. What's happening, sir? Are you hurt? I don't know. I think I've been here a long time, but it's all dark. I can't see anything, he replied, his voice fading slightly. Please, you have to help me. I don't think I belong here anymore. Something about his words didn't make sense. His voice sounded far away, muffled, like he was speaking from another place, another time. But his fear was unmistakable, and I couldn't ignore it. I'm sending someone to your location right now, I said, signaling the nearest unit to respond. Just stay on the line with me. For a moment, there was silence again, and I thought he'd hung up. But then he spoke, his voice soft, almost a whisper. "I need you to tell her I'm sorry." My heart raced. "Tell who? Sir, can you hear me?" "My wife," he said, his voice breaking. "Tell her I never meant to leave. Tell her I'm still waiting. I just want to come home." The line went dead. I sat there staring at the address I'd written down, feeling a strange mix of sadness and unease. It wasn't uncommon for callers to be in shock, to say strange things in moments of fear, but something about his voice lingered, haunting me. When the officers arrived at 432 Vieux Carré, they radioed back, confused. The location was an old, abandoned house, boarded up and clearly empty. There was no sign of anyone there, no indication that anyone had lived there for years. They searched the property but found nothing. No man, no phone, nothing that could explain the call I'd received. I was unsettled but tried to shake it off, telling myself it had to be a prank, someone trying to get a reaction. But that night, as I was driving home, I felt a strange compulsion to pass by the address. I didn't know why. I wasn't the type to follow up on my calls, but something about it felt unfinished, like I needed to see it with my own eyes. When I arrived, the house loomed over me, its broken windows and sagging roof giving it a haunted appearance. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of rain and something faintly metallic. I parked across the street, sitting in my car, staring at the house, trying to make sense of the strange feeling in my chest. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a figure in the upstairs window, a man standing still, his face in shadow. My heart raced and I blinked, convinced I was imagining things. But when I looked again, he was still there, watching. I got out of the car, my footsteps echoing in the empty street as I approached the house. The figure didn't move, didn't react, just stood there silent and unmoving. I reached the porch, my hand hesitating on the doorknob. Part of me wanted to turn back, but a stronger part, curiosity or maybe a need to understand, compelled me to go inside. The air was cold, colder than it should have been, and the smell of damp wood filled my nostrils as I stepped into the hallway. Dust covered every surface, undisturbed, as though no one had walked these floors in decades. But then I saw them, faint footprints leading up the staircase. I followed them, my heart pounding with every step. The footprints led me to the room at the end of the hall, the door slightly ajar. I pushed it open, holding my breath as I stepped inside. The room was empty, save for a small table by the window. On the table sat an old, faded photograph of a man and a woman, their faces worn and faded, but their smiles unmistakable. The man in the photo looked like the one I'd seen in the window. As I stared at the photograph, I felt a chill run down my spine, a sense of sadness that seemed to fill the room. I turned, and there he was, the man from the photo, standing in the doorway, his eyes hollow, his expression filled with regret. Did you tell her?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. I couldn't speak, couldn't move, frozen by the weight of his gaze. "Please," he said, his voice breaking. "Tell her I didn't want to leave. I tried to come home." His form began to fade, his outline growing faint, dissolving into the shadows. And as he disappeared, I heard his voice one last time, a soft, lingering whisper. "Tell her I'll always be waiting." I stumbled out of the house, my mind reeling, my heart heavy. I returned to the dispatch center the next day, trying to focus, to forget what I'd seen. But when I looked up the address in the records, I found an old report. The man's name was Thomas Jansen. He'd lived at 432 Vieux Carré with his wife Margaret, until he disappeared one night on his way home. No one had ever seen him again, and his wife had eventually moved away, her heart broken, believing he'd abandoned her. I found her last known address and decided, against all reason, to pay her a visit. When I met Margaret, she was an elderly woman, frail but still sharp. I told her I'd heard from Thomas, that he'd never meant to leave her, that he'd always wanted to come home. Tears filled her eyes as she listened, and she smiled, a bittersweet smile filled with years of pain and longing. "He was my everything," she whispered. I never stopped hoping he'd come back. As I left, I felt a strange sense of peace, as though I'd finally fulfilled a promise that had waited decades to be kept. And sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I still hear Thomas's voice, faint and distant, a reminder of a love that had transcended time, waiting to find its way home.
The Forest Secrets.
I'd recently moved to Eureka Springs, Arkansas, drawn by the peace and quiet of the Ozarks. The forests around here were deep, thick with mist in the mornings and stretching on for miles, untouched and serene. As a forest ranger, I was excited to start a new position patrolling the trails and maintaining the natural beauty of the region. But within days, I learned the forest was not as peaceful as it seemed. Locals warned me about certain areas, trails that people avoided due to strange sightings and stories of hikers who had gone missing. At first, I brushed it off as superstition. Every small town had its ghost stories, after all, and Eureka Springs was no different. But one night, while patrolling a less traveled part of the forest, I heard something strange, a soft rustling that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I stopped, shining my flashlight into the trees, seeing nothing but thick foliage and shadows. But the rustling grew louder, almost like whispering, like voices blending with the sound of leaves in the wind. I shook my head, chalking it up to an overactive imagination, and continued down the trail. But then, just as I rounded a bend, I saw it, a figure standing in the shadows, partially hidden by the trees. At first I thought it was a hiker, maybe someone lost, but as I approached, the figure slipped deeper into the woods, disappearing without a sound. I called out, but there was no answer, only silence. Over the next few days, I heard more stories about that area of the forest. Hikers spoke of seeing figures out of the corner of their eye, feeling watched, even hearing whispers that seemed to follow them. It became so frequent that I decided to patrol that section regularly, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever was scaring people. One evening, as the sun was setting, I found myself on that same trail again. The air was thick, almost oppressive, and the shadows stretched long across the ground. As I walked, I felt a prickling sensation at the back of my neck, the feeling that I was being watched. I stopped listening, and that's when I heard it. The whispering. This time it was closer, a soft murmur that seemed to come from all directions. I turned, shining my flashlight through the trees, and froze. Several figures stood in the shadows, their faces obscured, their bodies blending with the darkness. They were watching me, their eyes glinting in the faint light, unmoving, silent. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. The figures didn't respond. Instead, they began to move, slowly, silently, stepping closer, their forms shifting in the shadows like they were part of the forest itself. My heart pounded as I backed away, stumbling over a fallen branch. As I turned to run, I felt something cold brush against my arm. A hand, or what felt like a hand, grasping at me. I broke into a sprint, not daring to look back, the whispers following me, growing louder, more insistent. They were calling my name. I made it back to the ranger station, breathless and shaken. When I told my supervisor, he gave me a long, skeptical look but agreed to come with me to check out the area. Armed with stronger flashlights and a sense of duty, we headed back to the trail. The forest was eerily quiet, the usual sounds of wildlife absent, as though everything had been swallowed by silence. We walked for a while, finding nothing unusual. But just as I was beginning to think I'd imagined the whole thing, my flashlight caught something on a tree, a symbol carved deep into the bark, a spiral with lines radiating from the center. "What is this?" I asked, tracing the lines with my finger. My supervisor shook his head. "Never seen anything like it, but look, there's more." We found the symbols on several trees, each one leading deeper into the forest as though marking a path. Despite every instinct telling me to turn back, we followed the symbols, our footsteps muffled by the thick layer of leaves and moss. Then, without warning, we came to a clearing, and I felt the air grow colder. heavy with the scent of damp earth. In the center of the clearing was a massive tree, its branches twisted and gnarled, reaching out like skeletal hands. Symbols covered its trunk, each one carved deep, and a chill ran through me as I realized they formed a circle around the base. My supervisor looked uneasy, shifting on his feet. "We should go," he muttered, already turning away. But as we stepped back, the whispering returned, louder, more insistent, filling the clearing with an almost deafening sound. Shadows began to move around us, figures stepping out from behind the trees, watching with hollow, dark eyes. One figure stepped forward and I recognized him, a young man who had gone missing a month ago. His face was pale, his expression blank, but his eyes were filled with something dark, something that sent a chill through me. "Leave," he whispered, his voice blending with the others. "This place, it belongs to them now." I grabbed my supervisor's arm and we ran, the whispers following us, growing louder, filling the air with voices that seemed to come from the trees themselves. When we finally reached the edge of the forest, the whispers faded, leaving only silence. The next day, I returned to the clearing with a team, determined to find an explanation. But when we arrived, the clearing was empty, the symbols were gone, and the tree in the center looked normal, as though nothing had ever happened. No one believed me, of course, and my supervisor refused to speak about it, insisting that we'd imagined the whole thing. But I know what I saw, what I heard. And sometimes when I'm alone on the trails, I still hear the whispering, faint and distant, like the forest is calling to me, waiting for me to return to that place. And every time I pass that trail, I feel their eyes on me, watching, waiting, reminding me that some places in the forest are better left undisturbed. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the shadows. If these stories gave you chills, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more nights of mystery and suspense. And before you go, let me know in the comments. Have you ever felt a presence in a place you couldn't explain? I'd love to hear your stories. Until next time, remember, some secrets are better left in the dark. Sleep well, if you can.